everybody. My name is Haley Dushinsky. I'm the director of the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture here at Ohio University. I'd like to thank all of you so much for joining us today for what promises to be a wonderful and enlightening talk as part of Immigration Week. Before I begin my introduction, I'd like to extend very warmest and sincere thanks to Young Kim and to the Wealth and Poverty theme for all of the coordination and organizing to make Immigration Week possible. Thank you so much, Young. Thank you. And I'd like to now provide a very brief introduction to our speaker today. Professor Dr. Luis Plascencia earned his PhD in social anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. His single-authored book, entitled Disenchanting Citizenship, Mexican Migrants and the Boundaries of Belonging, was published with Rutgers University Press in 2012. And this book presents an experience of Mexican migrants in their pursuit of US citizenship. This book had many notable findings, among them the observation that some migrants became disenchanted with their new status in the United States. They felt that their acquisition of citizenship did not necessarily change how the larger society viewed them, basically as second-class members. More recently, Dr. Plascencia has co-edited a historically oriented anthology on the presence and the role of Mexican workers in the economic development of Arizona. And this book was published very recently in the fall of 2018 by the University of Arizona Press. That book is titled Mexican Workers and the Making of Arizona. Dr. Plascencia has also published multiple journal articles, book chapters. He's widely published in the field. His research interests include the anthropology of law, human rights and social justice, the Mexico-US borderlands, and labor trafficking. Dr. Plascencia has also presented expert testimony to several international and national governing institutions. And we are especially pleased because he has been contributing his expertise to the Ohio University community through his new position as an instructor in the new master's program in Law, Justice, and Culture, sponsored by the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture. So, Luis, we're very pleased to welcome you to campus, and we are eager to hear your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm eager to hear it too. Okay, I will first read some comments. I'll be a talking head for just a few minutes, and then I'll switch to more of a commentary mode. So you don't have to fall asleep yet. Okay. I would first like to take the opportunity to thank Professors Kim and Dushinsky for inviting me to share some ideas and perceptions, a lot of it based on research regarding the debate on migration. And at the end of the presentation, I'll try to make some comments to link it to wealth and poverty theme. My presentation today does not focus on a specific migrant community nor a specific migration law, enforcement practice, boundary control, or process related to asylum or citizenship. So in other words, it's not going to be a place or community-based presentation. What I want to do, focus more broadly on the debate that we've been having on sort of the contemporary debate on migration that essentially dates back to the early 1970s. But obviously we are still, we underwent a shutdown regarding a migration issue, a government shutdown. So for graduate students in the MA program in the Center for Law and Justice Culture, my discussion aligns with the research area related to legal consciousness. So you can sort of think of it that way. It engages law, legality, illegality, and political imaginaries. The debate on migration that is taking place is a discursive field where law is central, but it is traversed by constructs of race, gender, biology, the economy, US history, and other imaginaries and fantasies. It is also a complex web about power, the legitimacy and power of the state, the distribution of power at the state and local level, and the position of citizens and non-citizens within that web. Framed slightly different, it is a central debate about who belongs in the US, who can claim to be, quote, an American, and fears and concerns about what we want the future U.S. society to look like. Summarized in this way, we can see that these issues do not lend themselves to simple answers or simple fixes. Right? It's the complexity of it doesn't lend itself to just a simple solution. Say, well, if we do X, it'll take care of everything else. It won't. And just to kind of give you some context, the U.S. debate about migration is not new. It was an issue in the British colonies that became the U.S. Individual colonies confronted the issue of who shall be allowed to enter, who shall be granted citizenship, and who shall be banished from the respective colony. So the colonies, in essence, made those the range of decisions. If one reads the Declaration of Independence, one finds that one of the grievances listed is about how he, interesting enough, if you read the Declaration of Independence, the unnamed king, right? It's always he, which we, of course, we know as King George III. He has inhibited migration to the colonies. In other words, a grievance is being asserted that the colonies desire European migration, in essence, an open border and no walls. But the king was obstructing the free mobility of British subjects and other Europeans to migrate to the colonies. So segments of colonists were willing to violently rebel against their government, against the king, and migration was one of the grievances, in addition to the other grievances listed. And I think it's interesting because we normally don't think that migration was a grievance, or why the colonies decided to rebel and break away. So our own independence, the foundation of the U.S., in essence, was partly engaged with migration, a debate about migration. Before I proceed, I would like to ask you two questions, and you can just raise your hand. Has anybody been to the border? 1, okay. 3, 4, okay. Does anybody know approximately how far Athens is from the border? Or you can venture, you don't have to give a precise mileage, approximately. Anybody venture a guess? Like, how far are we now from the border?
1,500 miles.
1,500 miles?
The southern border.
Well, okay.
The Canadian border is a little bit closer.
Yeah.
Good point. So let's say 1,500. Any other guesses from the border? Okay, that's fine. Okay, in the presentation, I will focus on 4 elements that I think are important to the debate. These are not the only elements, but I think these are important enough that I can address within the time. One is about the distinction between civil versus criminal law. Secondly, the concept of the border. Third, the concept of amnesty. Third and fourth, the binary of legality versus illegality. Okay. Yeah, so let me just skip those comments. Okay, so one of the takeaways from the whole discussion is that migration law is complex. Okay, that's, most of you may have suspected that. But even pretty smart people like Supreme Court justices can be dumbfounded by its Byzantine nature and complexity. One example of that, Supreme Court Justice Alito got dizzy trying to make sense of what constituted an aggravated felony in the context of migration law. In the Padilla versus Kentucky case, he concurred with the majority, but in his concurring statement, he pointed out that he sought to make sense of what was the concept of aggravated felony in the context of migration. So this is a pretty smart guy, you know, trying to educate himself. I'm going to vote on an opinion, and I should have some information and some basis for taking that position. Anyway, he consulted the ABA guidebook and found the description to be dizzying. So a pretty smart guy trying to make sense. You know, he got dizzy. And these are some of the things he discovered. He discovered other things, but he discovered that an aggravated felony in the context of migration law does not require the crime to be aggravated or a felony, but can still be classified as an aggravated felony. Okay. Secondly, and specific acts that may be associated with a crime, such as drug trafficking, are aggravated felonies. But things like drug solicitation is a crime that commonly can accompany drug trafficking. It is not an aggravated felony. So this is what Justice Alito was trying to make sense regarding what the position should be in the Padilla, Kentucky case. Okay. One of the things that most of us, that the general public, has some confusion about is where migration law fits within our broad structure of civil versus criminal law. Okay. So discussions of border security, a border wall, illegal migrants, and other related topics are commonly expressed in popular discourse, and sometimes we are exposed to these in things such as, and some of these are have been made into bumper stickers, but they're not all bumper stickers. Illegal is illegal. Right? A straightforward assertion. But there's no gray, like illegal, maybe illegal. No, the assertion that there should be a clear understanding of migration law and the violation of migration law is simply, illegal is legal. What part of illegal don't you understand? I'm for legal immigration, but not illegal immigration. And this one is one that you commonly hear oftentimes from sort of fairly conservative commentators that will comment and assert this. Right? I'm completely against illegal. I'm for legal immigration, but I'm against illegal immigration. Or they crossed the border illegally, they broke the law, they are criminals. Right? So all of these assertions and similar ones basically assume that migration law must be related to criminal law in some way. Right? So it's the breaking of law in some sense. Okay. It isn't. Okay. The Immigration and Nationality Act, which is codified at 8 U.S.C., the U.S. Code, Title 8, is its own body, but it's considered civil administrative law. It is not criminal law. Criminal law is found in Title 18. Okay, so it's also interesting that in neither the Constitution or other key documents, the Constitution does not specify who shall have the power over migration. And Congress did not establish it. It was the Supreme Court, through a series of cases, that eventually came to the conclusion that the powers to regulate entry, removal, transit, and naturalization rest in Congress, completely in Congress. Congress can decide what they want to do. Okay. So migration law is civil administrative law. Since it is civil and administrative, the Miranda rule does not apply. But and a key part of that is that migrants do not have right to counsel. Why? Because they didn't commit a crime. Okay. Now, in the Immigration Nationality Act, there are penalties, and there's a classification on its own, but they are considered civil assessments. So the first violation of visa or first unauthorized entry is considered a misdemeanor, similar to many cities, and counties, and states. Littering, loitering, some forms of trespassing, those are misdemeanors. Okay. It is not a crime. It is a civil penalty. And the fine can be anywhere from $50 to $250. And in addition, the person may be held in detention 30 to 60 days. Apprehensions after the first apprehension and removal is a felony, but it's a civil felony. It is not a criminal felony. Okay. So on the second or later apprehensions, there can be a fine, there can be imprisonment up to 2 years, or both. And given other conditions, you can see the seriousness, right? It could be fine and imprisonment up to 10 years. That's substantial. Fine and imprisonment up to 20 years. That clearly is substantial. 20 years of your life in prison. But you got 20 years of your life in prison because you violated a civil and administrative rule. You did not commit a crime. Okay. Second topic, second element. Where is the border? There are two factors that complicate this simple question. One is part of our legal consciousness is grounded on the assumption that we know what constitutes the border of the U.S., the legal boundaries of our nation. Here, I'll just introduce a footnote. Previously, I've taught a course titled The Mexico-U.S. Borderlands, or another one called Citizenship and Nationalism. One of the rhetorical exercises that I used in that course is to ask students to draw the U.S. flag, not in precise terms, but simply draw the U.S. flags, including persons born and raised in the United States. And perhaps surprising, perhaps not, most students cannot draw the U.S. flag. They have a sense of it. Almost all of them get correct the corner, the little square that has, is blue. Has anybody seen the U.S. flag, by the way? Okay, good. So I don't have to describe it for you. Because I don't have an image of the flag here, so I assume that you've seen it. So most students can say, oh, there's a square that has 50 stars and is blue. And the stars are generally white. Okay. The other part of the flag, great confusion. Confusion. How many stripes are there? 13. Okay, but when you ask undergraduate students to draw it, they can put 10 lines, 11, 12. I think one student put 15. What color is the first color? Red. Right? Many undergraduate students start with white. Right? But yet, their legal consciousness of their own flag that they've seen thousands of times, by the time they get to college, they've seen it thousands of times. If you ask them, do you know what the U.S. flag looks like? Oh, yeah, that's. No. Can I get extra credit points for that? It's certainly that, yes, I know exactly what the flag. Then you ask them to draw it, you get a different impression. Right? So our legal consciousness is part of our everyday. We operate with these notions of law, legality, illegality, and they become commonsensical to us. We take them for granted that we ourselves are clear about them, and that we could easily address that issue or question. So one is we assume that we know the borders. Does anybody know the borders of the boundaries of the United States? But, oh, okay. I assume that you kind of know. I won't ask you to draw it, but I have asked you to draw it. Nobody gets all the boundaries. Okay. The other element is that since the 1840s, we have come to associate the label the border as indexing a single national boundary, the Mexico-U.S. boundary, not the 100+ other boundaries or borders that exist in the United States. So when there's a debate about a border wall, right, most of us read a Mexico-U.S. border wall. Most of us do not think of a Canada-U.S. border or a Lake Erie wall. We could build one. Okay, so that we commonly talk about border security, the need for a border wall, border enforcement, there's border patrol. So part of our very language, including the advocates of migrants themselves, they become engaged with the same language that they're opposing, right? So someone can say, we need a border wall. I can say, no, I'm completely against the border wall. So the discourse and debate can run on that plane. But those opposing the wall tend not to raise the basic question, which border? Right? Okay, so just for those of you who may not know the territory of the United States, the territory of the 50 states and of possessions of the U.S. Guam, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Northern Mariana Islands, and others. All those constitute part of the U.S. territory. Land occupied by U.S. military installations across the globe, the land, the territory that the base sits at, that is U.S. territory. U.S. embassies in other countries. So the U.S. embassy in Tokyo, that is the U.S. territory. Okay, plus others. Okay, then there's a caveat. There's also territory within the U.S. that is not U.S. territory. American Indian reservations are not technically U.S. territory. They are physically in what makes up the U.S. territory, but that is not U.S. territory. U.S. does have some law enforcement control. For example, a U.S. Marshal can go into a reservation and say, "No, I came there to arrest you." So there are police powers that the federal government has, even though it's not U.S. territory. But a local police department in the adjacent area or county can go in and say, "I'm here to arrest, Flying Rabbit." Can't do it. There's no jurisdiction because that territory is outside the United States. Foreign embassies located in the U.S. So if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., in this sort of embassy row, most of that territory is not in, well, if there's an embassy there, that's not a U.S. territory. That territory belongs to the nation being represented at that embassy. The site of the United Nations is not U.S. territory. If you've ever been to New York, you've been near the UN building, that's not U.S. territory. So where is the border? The simplicity of the question hides the complexity. Right. The continental U.S. has 4 boundaries: Canada, U.S., Mexico, U.S., as well as a West Coast and an East Coast. The Canada-U.S. border is roughly 5,000 miles. The Mexico-U.S. border is about 2,000 miles. Alaska has approximately 1,500-mile border with Canada. So it's almost as long as the Mexico-U.S. border. The Supreme Court ruled in 1973 that all international airports are border equivalents. So in essence, has anybody been to the Columbus International Airport? Well, you entered the border. Once you've entered the area marked as the international airport, you have entered the border. Okay. In 1954, the Immigration and Naturalization Service issued an administrative rule, and here I highlighted in red to point out that when we talk about law, it's not simply statutory law. You can have also administrative rules that in essence, in effect, become equivalent to law. So they issued an administrative rule that the space 100 miles from a land border is part of the border. Okay. This is a map that the ACLU generated to give you a sense of what that 1954 administrative rule created. That constitutes the border of the United States, of the continental part. Of course, if you can see that here, Hawaii, all of Hawaii is the border. All of Puerto Rico is the border. All the Mariana Islands are the border. All of Guam, all the Virgin Islands are border. Because they're less than 100 miles. You start with the edge of one of those islands. Well, if it's only 20 miles, then when you get to the other side, you're still in the border. You never leave the border. Alaska has a huge border because the Aleutian Islands, which is the chain of islands that continues, it's almost like 2,000 miles in length. So that border, every single one of those tiny little islands that make up the Aleutian chain is the border. Okay. All right, so that's kind of, okay. Now something interesting about this map is that if you were to ask people, let's say in Chicago or in Seattle, do you live in the border? What do you think their answer would be? No. Chicago? We're about 1,500 miles from the border, right? So, no, New Orleans, Beaumont, Houston, San Antonio, not Austin's in the interior of the United States, etc. But what's also important about this map is that 2/3 of the US population live in the border. 2/3 of the US population. The other third lives in, no offense to Ohio, but outside south of Columbus. That's where the other third lives. 2/3 lives in that strip. So 2/3 of the US population lives in the border. To me, it's also interesting, if you've ever been to Detroit, you will notice that in Detroit, there are no businesses, no chambers of commerce, no hotels that advertise themselves that we're a border entity. Or even people in Detroit don't think of themselves as border residents. Strangely enough, because there's a small bridge that connects with Detroit to Windsor. Windsor, by the way, is in Canada. So you live across the bridge, but you don't live in the border. Right? And there you can see how the legal consciousness also has its own history that is based on locality. That everyone in El Paso is clear that they live in the border. There is no doubt. Nobody ever doubts it. There's border-oriented restaurants. The Chamber of Commerce announces border activities, et cetera, et cetera. Not in Detroit. Detroit, there are no border activities as such. Okay. The happy face is Athens. I more or less placed it correctly, but I didn't use any GPS coordinates to be exact. Is part of Ohio in the border? Most of the population in Ohio lives in the border. So approximately, you were correct. So approximately, how far are we now from the border? Knowing them, 75, 76. We are 76 miles from the border. We're not, sorry, the gentleman, we're not 1,500 miles. And so, let's see, this is a kind of better one. Okay, so this is perhaps a better indication. And if you actually look at the geography, North Bass Island, if anybody's been there, this is the international boundary, Canada, the US. It's about a mile to a mile and a half. So another way to view it, Ohio is about a mile and a half from the border, because North Bass Island is part of the great state of Ohio. So Ohio is only about a mile and a half from the border. But do you, as Athenians or Ohioans, do you think that you live in the border and that you're that close to the border, or that your state is that close to the border? No. Okay, so those are kind of descriptive stuff. Okay, so now kind of the issues related to law. So why does it matter that we have a 100-mile border and international airports that are border equivalents? They are real. They have real impacts. It really matters to both citizens, and that's why I highlight citizens, and non-citizens. So it's not simply about that 100-mile impacts those other people, the non-citizens. It doesn't affect me because I'm an American. Well, it does affect you. It means that immigration officials can conduct a routine inspection of persons, vehicles, and possessions without reasonable suspicion. All right? I can simply say, please open your purse, your pocket. I can do it at the Columbus International Airport. I can do it in North Bass Island. I can do it in Columbus, at least the part of Columbus. Please open your bag. What do you mean? Now, if you have, where did I put it? Well, if you've seen the Know Your Rights little card by ACLU, right? it tells you that you have rights. And one of them is you have a right to refuse consent to be searched and seized. Do you have that right in, let's say, Toledo, Akron, Cincinnati? Do you? No, if it's a customs official or ICE. Please open the bag. Oh, no, I'm not consenting. Please open the bag. Okay, please get out of the car. I want to search your car. I'm not consenting to your search. Ma'am, get out of the car. Okay? Because I don't need reasonable suspicion to search you or your car or your possessions or your smartphone, your laptop in that 100-mile area where 2/3 of the U.S. population live. Okay. They can do this because in 1789, the first U.S. Congress granted boundary officials the power to inspect persons, goods, and beasts. That was their language. There aren't that many beasts crossing except into Texas and some in Arizona, some in New Mexico, basically of cattle coming in. But a customs official can also inspect the cattle entering the U.S. territory. But because the border, so that's what Congress labeled essentially the border exception to the Fourth Amendment. So I, as a customs or border official, have a right to ask you to empty your backpack. If I stop you in Toledo or in Cincinnati, please open your backpack. Oh, I have my ACLU civil rights card. Good, that's nice. Please open it. And so it also matters because the Department of Justice rules, they issued some rules on racial profiling in the U.S. by federal officials. There's a footnote to the Department of Justice memo on that exempts the border zone from those rules. If you kind of flip, what that means is that racial profiling is being authorized and approved by the Department of Justice in the border zone. A federal official can say, today I'm stopping whites for some reason. Well, I can do it. And I'm a federal official. I'm an FBI or DEA or ATF agent. I can stop and take action against you. Okay, but you say, well, I'm a law-abiding citizen. I know if they want to do that, that's fine, because I'm not doing anything wrong. Okay, but if there is reasonable suspicion, and that's a broad category that can include false positives on the part of canine dogs. So if I have my canine dog and the dog somehow slightly barks at you when I walk by, that's reasonable suspicion. I now, because I have reasonable suspicion, I can, please come with me. I can ask you to undress completely. I can inspect your body cavities. Said, I'm an American citizen, you can't do that. Yes, I can. Because I'm in the border zone and I have reasonable suspicion to do it. And body cavities, I can ask you to observe a bowel movement and also other stuff. Okay, so it matters. So that 100-mile 1954 rule has consequences if you're a citizen as well as a non-citizen. Having citizenship does not give you the full Fourth Amendment protections in the border zone, which means two-thirds of the U.S. population does not have full Fourth Amendment protections. Athens does, by the way, because Athens is outside the border zone. So you're lucky here. But don't ever go to Columbus International Airport, though. Third element, amnesty. Okay, I refer to it as the A word. Is an important example of how a public discourse can sustain a particular understanding of law, yet misrecognize the multiplicity of examples in law and history that contest that meaning. And this is just one example. There are many examples. When President Obama announced his executive enactment of DACA in 2012, there was multiple comments by people that opposed this. And these are only two. The first one's by Lamar Smith, former representative from the San Antonio area of Texas. The other one by Steve King from Idaho. The administration's amnesty policy not only violates the rule of law, it only benefits illegal immigrants, not Americans, and is a magnet for fraud. So amnesty is a magnet for fraud and basically rewards criminality. Americans should be outraged that President Obama is planning to usurp the constitutional authority of the United States Congress and grant amnesty by edict to 1 million illegal aliens. The American people have rejected amnesty because it will erode the rule of law. Right? So they were these are members of Congress who should have some sense of the Constitution and law. Okay. More recently, President Trump announced that he might agree to a deal with Speaker Pelosi in which he would grant some time to DACA recipients or applicants in exchange for his border wall. Shortly after, Ann Coulter, the conservative political commentator, commented in a Twitter post, "Amnesty! Trump proposes amnesty. We voted for Trump and we got jabbed." And shortly after, Trump kind of distanced himself. And I really wasn't, I'm also against amnesty. Oh, okay, that's okay. So what is amnesty, and does it violate the rule of law? The term amnesty is derived from a Greek combination of a as a negative prefix to nestes or nestos, meaning not remembering, forgetting, oblivion. And here I should add that amnesty can come in different flavors. It can be complete amnesty, it can be partial amnesty, it could be conditional amnesty. So I could say, well, I'm going to grant you amnesty on these conditions, that if you do this, that, you can maintain this amnesty. If you violate any of those things, it's over. You're out. Now, what is overlooked in the common public discourse about amnesty, that amnesty is intrinsic to U.S. law and the legal order. It is central to it. It is even written in the Constitution. Even though, right, from those statements, you would think that, no, this is completely against the rule of law. The U.S. would never support, all Americans oppose amnesty. Well, it's in the Constitution. It gives the president power to grant reprieves and pardons. Parenthesis, synonyms for amnesty. The Constitution has an amnesty clause. And interestingly enough, as a footnote, Trump pardoned former Sheriff Joe Arpaio. But there was no commentary after that saying, Mr. President, why are you granting amnesty? No. Right? It's okay for the president to pardon someone. It's constitutional, and it is. President Trump has the power, continues to have the power, to pardon people that have committed federal crimes. He has that power. The Constitution gives him that power. So there's nothing wrong on the part of a president to grant a pardon or reprieve. It's in the Constitution. Right? The president say, well, look up the Constitution. This Section 2 gives me that power. Okay? All right. Status of forces agreements. Those are the agreements that we sign with nations where we have military forces. And basically, it grants amnesty to our soldiers. It says that if one of our soldiers commits a crime, whether in Japan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, that country cannot bring charges against our U.S. national because of status of forces agreement. We can file, like the military, the army or the unit, can initiate a court-martial of the person. But that's us. We are granting amnesty to our soldiers. And no, we're not going to expose them to the Syrian government saying, or the British government saying, well, no, one of your soldiers raped someone, we're going to take him and charge him with, and in our law, it's execution. No. We grant amnesty to our soldiers. We protect them. We grant them a certain immunity. The Ohio governor in the very Ohio Constitution, has the power to grant pardons and clemency. Parenthesis, a form of forgetting, oblivion, not remembering. State revenue agencies commonly have, no, not annually, but sometimes they say, well, this year we'll have a taxpayer, sometimes they call it amnesty, sometimes they call it a forgiveness program, right? If you owe X amount, if you come in and make 10% payment of that, we will forget, not remember that you owed the money. Police departments oftentimes have gun collection drives. If you have any illegal guns that you own, bring them in. We'll take them. And we're not going to ask you your name or your address. We're not going to write down your license plate. Just bring them in. Oh, here's my AK-45 that I bought at a flea market. Oh, bring it in. That's okay. There will be no charges brought against you. Public libraries. I'm sure some of you may have experienced these. Sometimes public libraries have overdue fines for books that are due, or that your children may have checked out. They forgot to tell you. And pretty soon you get a note from the library saying, you owe $30. Okay. Well, oftentimes public libraries have an amnesty program. If you come in and pay some portion of the fee, or if you bring the book back, we will not remember. We will consider oblivion. We will forget. Plea agreements. Right? I can charge you with 15 counts of, like we did with Vice President Agnew. The Department of Justice had a count of about 40 counts, a 40-count indictment against the Vice President as a sitting Vice President. But they negotiated and said, well, those other 39, even though we have evidence that you broke the law, we will not remember those. But as long as you agree to one, sort of tax, I think tax evasion or tax failing to file taxes. But prior to that, we'll let you resign as Vice President. But we're only going to charge you with that one crime, even though we have 39 others. So what's happening to the 39? They're being forgiven, not remembered. Confidential information informants. They can commit crimes, but because they're your confidential informant, they say, God, please stop doing that. What have you just done? You granted a sort of amnesty. You said, okay, but just stop doing that. Or if you do it, make sure I don't find out about it. Okay, and this is perhaps a more important one historically for the history of the nation. In the context of U.S. history, one of the most important and consequential amnesties was the one signed by President Andrew Jackson, Proclamation 179 in 1868. And this is the text of the proclamation. This is the title, Proclamation 179, granting full pardon and amnesty for the offense of treason against the United States during the late Civil War. So President Jackson granted amnesty to all individuals that committed treason against the United States of America, which essentially meant the North. Okay? So what were the implications of not granting citizenship? These would have had a real historical consequence for this nation. Well, if we followed the rule of law or applied the full force of the law, we could have brought charges against all members of the Confederate Army, every single one of them, at all levels. Even if you're a private, low-level private, you acted against the United States of America. You committed treason. Okay. Secondly, it also would apply to all civilians. Okay, because civilians, including women, children, and men, who provided aid and comfort to the Confederate forces, had also committed treason against the United States of America. So Jackson basically was facing two options. One, well, really three. One, do mass incarceration. With contemporary, we talk about mass incarceration. This would have been mass incarceration. Every Confederate soldier and every civilian who had provided aid to Confederate forces would have been incarcerated, right? Because we believe in the rule of law. and the force of law that people commit. We don't reward criminals. Remember the critique? We don't reward criminals. So if you commit treason, that's a crime. Okay, we don't reward criminals. We're going to apply the full force of the law. Do a mass incarceration. Extremely costly. Imagine the massive prison building operation that would have had to take place to imprison all people that participated and supported the Confederate forces. And an even worse option was to, one of the judgments that could be made is to suffer death if you commit treason against the United States of America. So what would that have meant? Mass genocide. Like, essentially, President Jackson ordering the hanging and shooting of every person in the Confederate Army, or as well as women, children, and men who aided the Confederate Army. That would have been mass genocide. Right? All those people would have been killed. He opted to give amnesty, which is obviously the more rational one, in the hope that we can reunite this nation as one, that we can have a United States of America as a nation, rather than a former nation that we then incarcerated or executed a large portion of that nation. Element 4. In our legal consciousness, we commonly operate with this notion that things are clear. Things are on this side, things are legal, and there are things on this side that are illegal. Does that schema make sense to us? Right? We operate with this consciousness. This makes sense to us. We take this for granted, that you're either on this side or you're on this side. Simple binary. Of course, you can suspect that there's a complexity to that. We have a long list of exceptions where this, in the context of migration, the nice, clean, solid line between two fields is blurred. One, in 1929, note the year, 1929. None of you were born that year, but it's a while back. Congress enacted what's called the registry provision in migration law. That registry provision essentially grants amnesty to persons who remain undetected. So if you're undocumented or you overstayed your visa, but you're smart enough to not be detected, we will give you permanent residency because you were smart enough to remain undetected. Oh, okay. So in our previous image, you can be moved from this side to that side if you were smart enough to remain undetected. Congress enacting a registry provision. Now, we updated, past the 1929, that was updated several times, and we last updated the date required in 1986. President Reagan signed that. We updated the date to January 1, 1972. So, if Young is undocumented and she's able to prove, well, I've been here since 1971. I've remained undetected. Oh, well, here's your permanent residency. Oh, thank you. Second one, Cuban Adjustment Act. It was passed in 1966, and President Obama ended it in January 12, 2017. The Cuban Adjustment Act was kind of a quite clever scheme. It basically said if you're Cuban and you either enter in a coastal area like Florida, or if you enter through Mexico, because there's a short distance between Cuba and Mexico from the Yucatan Peninsula, you can come through Mexico. And if you enter through Texas and you evade the Border Patrol and you happen to arrive on the US side, you can say, I'm Cuban. Oh, okay, come right in. I don't need to ask you for papers, and do you have a visa? Do you have any papers? Oh, here's your permanent, you can come in and you can start your process of becoming a permanent resident. Oh, thank you. So if a Mexican and a Cuban enter at the same time, same place, same location, were chased by the same Border Patrol, one gets detained and puts in a detention camp, The other one is let free and says, well, welcome to America, simply because you're Cuban. And of course, the politics of that has to do with the fact that Congress sought to protect people escaping communism. So those people can be undocumented and arrive without any papers, but that's okay. We will move them towards permanent residency and eventually citizenship. So we give them a path to citizenship even though they're undocumented up to essentially the end of December 2016. There's another interesting provision, and I wrote a whole article about this one, but I'm not going to bore you with the details. The essence is that 8 U.S.C. 1440 is a section in the Immigration and Nationality Act that grants citizenship to individuals in active duty as well as, well, in active duty during peacetime and wartime. The actual language of the law dates back to 1940. Okay, keep track of the years. It's not like these liberals, Obama followers, that read the New York Times and listen to NPR. No. Right? This is 1940. The statute itself, the idea, the concept, goes back to the Civil War. Starting in the Civil War, the nation recognized that someone serving to protect the nation in a military role, he or she should be rewarded. The reward is citizenship. Now, and the language is also funny. The 1940 law doesn't say if you're undocumented, you can get citizenship. It says something to the effect that if you arrive without formal permission, and it's a very long phrase, if you happen to kind of arrived, right, if you then, okay, what does that mean? Oh, it means that you're undocumented. Yes, if you're undocumented and you're able to get into the military and you're in active duty, the first day of your active duty service, you can initiate your application for U.S. citizenship. And you will be granted that. Even though, right, all Americans have rejected amnesty. Okay. The selective service registration. All males, that means tall, short, bearded, non-bearded, whether they fell from the sky or swam, or it doesn't matter. All are required, if they're male and their age is between 18 and 25, they must register for the selective service system. Your status does not matter to the selective service system. Right, so the legal, illegal, again, it's not as clear. The War and National Defense Act requires that all registrants, that means all people that registered in the selective service system, can be drafted to serve in the military interest of the nation. That means that whether you're tall, short, undocumented, not undocumented, asylee, refugee, you can be drafted in the military defense of the United States of America. Okay. And there are multiple, but I just list one more. In 2004, the National Defense Authorization Act created posthumous citizenship. So if you're undocumented or non-citizen, the concern was largely the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. But if you fought in any of those theaters and you were killed, you would be granted U.S. citizenship. So if you were undocumented and got killed in Iraq, which did happen, now you can say, well, that's kind of silly. What does it matter? The guy's already dead. Well, it does matter. Because we live in a heteronormative society. The person may have a spouse. And we believe in the family. So the person may also have children. Now the father was granted citizenship. So basically the spouse and children can also be granted citizenship, even though they're undocumented. So posthumous citizenship is not a nonsense thing, right? There are real benefits to real people. And also, even if you're not dead, the spouse and children have access to, they can enter a military base, buy at the commissary. They can receive some VA health benefits, even though we allege that we don't provide medical care to undocumented. Okay. In general, we don't. But there are exceptions. Okay, I need to go a little faster now. Okay, migration, wealth, and poverty. Voluntary and involuntary migration, and there was quite a bit, and this is sort of one of the misunderstandings, misrecognitions of our own history, that we don't recognize that a large proportion of the early migrants to the US, to the colonies, came as indentured servants, not seeking religious freedom, because the colonies were offering religious freedom, and we opened our doors, they could all come. No. They came because somebody contracted with them to work for a certain period of time. So it was voluntary, and since they agreed to sign up for the involuntary, the indentured servanthood. So many of the initial population of the United States were indentured servants from Europe, mainly from Britain. Okay. So we also asked forced mobility. So combination of multiple waves of migration have been central to the creation of wealth in the United States. The wealth that's been created has been on the backs of these multiple generations over time that have come to the US, whether they were coming from Ireland, they were coming from Italy, they were coming from Britain, they were coming from Germany, etc., or some of them from Canada, some of them from Mexico. They all have had a role in creating the wealth that is here. Migrants with different skills have created wealth for corporations and employers, obtained some benefits for themselves, and in many instances, they themselves became employers who relied on other migrants for their wealth. Right? So even when you talk about migrants, non-migrants, it gets really fuzzy, because there are employers. There's even some stories of undocumented women with children in Mexico and Central America that migrate and have nanny roles in the US. And they may have their children in the US. They will hire a younger undocumented woman to take care of their children. Right? So at the same time, some households providing employment for her, she is creating employment for another woman. They're both undocumented. And so the economic picture is a picture of multiple strands all operating at the same time. Poverty. Migration has also has produced and sustained different degrees of poverty. This has taken place principally through the action of employers and the state in the formation and sustainment of low-wage work. Does anybody eat chicken? How about like fast food chicken? Popeyes? Anybody like Popeyes? I kind of like Popeyes. Well, if you've eaten Popeyes and some of the other fast food, that chicken comes from Case Farms. Case Farms has a plant here in Ohio and one in North Carolina. Case Farms, the Department of Labor brought some charges against them. Case Farms was largely relying on undocumented Guatemalan population, mainly Mayans, to work at the plant at very low wages. The company itself was providing documents, right? This company like, okay, I'm going to hire you. Yeah, here's the papers that you need to give me. Okay, you have your papers? Oh, okay, you're hired. The company itself say, okay, no, your new name is, and they finally got caught. But it was the corporation that was seeking to maximize their profits. Say, how do we reduce our labor costs? Well, one is get a low wage of labor as possible. And also, that's dangerous work. It's the work itself operates at a very high speed, and essentially knives that you use in your hand. Right? So you stand at the assembly line, and that carcass of the chicken comes right in front of you, and your task is a particular task. But of course, the chicken's coming pretty fast. You better move fast. But you're moving fast with a knife in your hand. Right. Okay. So the poverty angle is that sometimes employers and the state have a role in sustaining a system of low-wage work, sustaining poverty. No. Okay, so how do we sustain low-wage work? One, agricultural and non-agricultural employers, with the support of the U.S. government, have ensured that the continued presence of low-wage workers, sometimes in violation of law. We have, in 1885, the U.S. passed a contract labor law that said every employer is prohibited from recruiting workers outside the U.S. to come work at jobs in the U.S. And there's a huge fine. Actually, for 1885, I think the fine was $1,000 per person. $1,000 in 1885 dollars. That's a lot of money. Employers found a way to bypass the law. Some employers continued their recruitment. Employers in the Southwest had the cooperation of migration officials, who many of the migration officials thought that the law only applied to Europeans coming to the United States. No. The law didn't say Europeans. It said every employer is prohibited from recruiting, aiding, it was a long period, recruiting, aiding, supporting, endorsing, etc. But customs officials, so you're coming to work for this cotton farm? Okay, come right in. And the employer was there recruiting, bringing the workers to the U.S. That's perfectly okay. So sometimes state actors support the violation of law. Also, the U.S. government has elected not to interfere with the market, principally meaning employers, and has allowed the violation of wage and hour and workplace safety laws. Sometimes some laws exist that are actually look very good on paper, but every law has the discretionary issue, which is the question of enforcement. Just because the law is there, if it's never enforced, the law has no meaning. So there are, on paper, a number of protections for workers, et cetera, but historically, the U.S. government has chosen not to really aggressively implement those. So laws have been enacted that on the surface are aimed at addressing the presence of undocumented migrants in the economy, but multiple administrations have largely ignored those laws, even when they claim to support it. President Reagan in 1986 signed the Employer Sanctions Law. That says that every employer who hires a person who is not authorized to work in the U.S., that's their language, parenthesis, undocumented, is prohibited. And there's supposed to be fines, and eventually there could be criminal charges filed, etc. President Reagan signed it in 1986. Every administration since the Reagan administration has chosen not to enforce it. The law is in place, but the state has chosen not to enforce it. So despite national political discourses about aiming to create jobs for Americans, political elites are often involved in supporting the employment of undocumented and temporary low-wage workers, or even in some cases, they become the employers themselves. They employ that labor. So in conclusion, and I'm not going to read it for you. So in conclusion, what I've tried to do is paint a picture of the complexity of migration law and the complexity of the debate. That it's a complex debate that's intersected by not only questions of law and legality and illegality, but also questions of history, questions of how we remember and know our own history. And also there are economic interests that come into play. So the debate is not a simple binary, like if you do A, that'll take care of the matter. It doesn't. Finally, obviously the issue of border wall has been debated for quite some time. We started actually building border fences, border walls in the early 1970s. So the idea of the border wall itself is not new. But what is new is obviously the emphasis on it. And this is an example of this already exists. So this is just one sample of the wall. There are different designs. Some are taller, some are shorter. When President Trump ordered active duty military to come to the southern boundary, in some of the lower level fences, they added concertina wire on top. There's several prototypes that are being discussed. These are just images of some of them. And you can see the bottoms. It's roughly about 12 feet in width. And you can see that these are the prices of those individual walls. Okay, so number 8, which is the one to the right, it's only about $486,000 for that piece. Okay, how long is the U.S.-Mexico border? About 2,000 miles. How long is the Canadian border? About 5,000. You want to build a wall? Yes, we all should support building a wall. We should ask Speaker Pelosi to recommend to President Trump that he submit a plan to build a wall across the entire Canadian border, as well as the Alaska-Canada border and the Mexico-US border. Well, that's roughly about 10,000 miles of border. Now, if you can divide it to 12 feet, and that's just the cost of that prototype. Okay. Then you have the reality. We normally think a wall like this one, right? We all agree this is a wall. It's pretty straight, right? It makes sense. Well, here's a wall. Okay, the lower Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, this is what the border looks like. Do you think it would cost more to build a wall there? Yeah, that's the river. That's the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo River. Yeah. So you build a wall in the U.S., which you'd say start here, come around here, you loop it again, you come around, you bring it back down. And do you think that adds cost versus building a wall like this? And simply the engineering. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures of a border. This is a Canada-U.S. border. Do you think the border looks any different from like the other previous picture? Can anybody see the boundary? And I have a little collection of Canadian photographs that look very much like this, or have a little cone, say. You've entered the U.S., or you've entered Canada. So anyway, I will end there. Okay. So.
We have about 15 minutes, right?
No, I think we have I think to 120 or 120 or 130. 120, I think.
130? Any questions?
Any questions, comments, observations? Yes.
Okay. So I had a real problem with your assumption.
Okay.
You said illegal when using the term illegal is based on the premise that they're violating criminal law. That's tendentious, unfair, and you did that yourself at the end. At the end, when you were talking about the economic effects of illegal immigration on, things like wages, you did that too.
Well,
it doesn't matter
right.
that it's civil law. When you can't say that everyone who says that they want a certain legal limit on immigration, that just because that's not criminal law doesn't mean it doesn't matter. The vast majority of law in this country is civil, and when you violate civil law, some of them are extremely serious.
Well, right. When you get 20 years.
So that's a really irrelevant and tendentious argument.
Right.
And those are the kind of arguments that actually stymie, getting to the more substantive issues.
Okay.
It's not fair to say, if somebody uses the term illegal immigration or they want the rule of law, to say, well, most violations of immigration law aren't criminal. That's irrelevant. Civil law can be violations of civil law have very serious consequences.
Including
and people often mean that, and it's not fair to say.
Up to 20 years, right? That's serious.
Yes, so it's not that, you should just throw that out. This is part of, you had a very long presentation to begin with, the complexity.
Yeah,
that is the sort of thing that makes the substantive issues, which are controversial to begin with, that much worse.
Right. And part of what's wrong is that's what I was trying to highlight in that same debate. And one issue that I didn't highlight is the question of terminology itself. Right? So what is our popular discourse for categories of migrants? And
I assume everyone who uses that term is using it. That's what I say. You framed that in a way.
Right.
You said, well, this is based on the premise that they're violating criminal law, and that's not necessarily true at all. When many people say illegal, they aren't referring to criminal law. They may know that. And you yourself did that at the end when you got into what I would say is the more substantive issues, which are the actual economic effects
Well,
of things like illegal hiring, and also similarly with the problem with amnesty. Okay, so this term amnesty, again, you're getting into very sort of, you're using the term tangentiously. Just because it happened to be in 1986, that term was used, so it came back. It doesn't mean, you know, that they're not saying when they're against amnesty. You know, and then you say, well, there are many ways in which people get amnesty for various things. Maybe true, but that's not really relevant. In the case of so in the case of illegal immigration, and I'm going to use that, there's a reason why. When our immigration law was changed, mainly in 1965, with some, you know, variation since then. And when it changed in the 20s, there was a reason why people wanted some limits. Okay.
Right.
The change had to do with the origin.
Right. There's
but
always
the
been
agreement
limits.
was that there would be some limits.
Right. There's always been
if
limits.
If no laws against the limits are enforced, then you don't have limits. And that absolutely has all kinds of economic and environmental consequences for different people. It obviously, yes, of course, a lot of employers and corporations make more money on low-wage work. But it's not good for many workers.
Right.
And taxpayers have been picking up the tab for generations, and we did, and then people say, well, the Statue of Liberty. When we had the Statue of Liberty, there was no welfare state. There was very little infrastructure. It was very cheap. You know, you went and you drilled your own well. You didn't expect municipalities to pay the cost of increasing population, and now you do, because people expect. You know, they expect clean water, they expect, you know, natural gas infrastructure, they expect electrical infrastructure. That just wasn't true at the time of the Statue of Liberty. So it isn't unreasonable to expect that there be limits overall, and that the limits be enforced in some way. We can have some debate about how they should be enforced. But when people, you know, say, well, you shouldn't even use the term illegal because, you know, immigration isn't about criminal law, it doesn't matter. Civil law, violations of civil law can be very serious, and those are important too. When people say the problem with the last, quote unquote, amnesty in 1986, the government, I know because I was a demography student, I have a master's degree in demography from UC Berkeley. We studied about what happened in 1986. In 1986, the US government said there were 1.5 million unauthorized immigrants.
No, but 3 million.
What happened? 3 million showed up, and then they said, and we're going to do this so that we won't have much future. And we now have at least 4 times as many unauthorized immigrants. So you can see it's not about an amnesty for a public library. The consequences of saying that that the government won't enforce much against illegal immigration are much more drastic than the consequences of a library saying, okay, you know, you can bring your books back and I won't charge you a fine.
In the back, I think students want to ask some questions.
Just a quick comment on the taxpayer part.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a quick comment on the taxpayer part. That's kind of a separate lecture, but on the taxpayer part, what gets lost in that is that all persons in the U.S. pay taxes.
Yes,
All taxes.
Low-wage workers don't pay as much in taxes as they make in the wages.
in
That's
this-
been studied
right,
many times,
right.
including by the last National Academy of Sciences
Right.
study, showed that low-wage workers do not pay enough in taxes to
Well,
make up for what they get in welfare.
But what they left out is that,
That matters.
what they left out is that under the Social Security Administration it allows for payment. Okay, yep.
For his turn, so.
I don't want to say anything, she just wasn't letting him talk.
Okay, it's okay.
But he is now, so,
No, go ahead.
I don't have a question. I just want to say.
Oh, okay. No, on the taxpayer, what gets lost in that, all residents of the U.S. pay taxes. Whether it's consumption taxes,
Of course.
property
And
taxes.
all these studies take that into
Okay.
account.
Well, but what they don't take into account is that under the way the Social Security Administration works, right?
That's
wh-
only one kind of tax.
I know.
The federal level, the state
Right.
level, and the local level
Right.
are entirely different, and that's
Right.
part of the problem.
Right.
And that was
Right.
recognized
Yeah, I know.
by Hillary Clinton.
No, okay, but anyway,
She doesn't, you may not think that he's saying anything I don't know.
oh, okay, but on the a common thing is that is not known about the Social Security Administration. They're basically the unmatched monies that employers pay into the system. Okay, is based on a division of what the Social Security Administration and the Treasury Department receive when they're not able to match a Social Security number. So employer X sends a payment of whatever $10,000 for 2 workers for X period of time. When Social Security Administration cannot match that, they have a little piggy bank called the earnings suspense file. About $9 billion are paid annually into that. And what the Social Security Administration has calculated that essentially it's money that undocumented are donating to the U.S.
We know, we demographers have
Right.
known this since the 1980s.
Right.
But what's often not admitted, that's at the federal level.
Right.
It was
Right.
pointed out in the 1980s and the 1990s that
Right.
it's true
Right.
that illegal immigrants
that-
pay more into the
Right.
federal system. They do not pay more into the state and local system. And when politicians and certain advocacy groups
Okay.
ignore that, that's part of the dishonesty about this issue. That has to be taken into account. It's true. You can't just
Right.
say
There
at
is
the
a-
federal level,
Right.
it's true that illegal immigrants pay more into the system. It is not true at the state and local level, and that matters. And even Hillary Clinton recognized that in the 1990s.
It depends
but
on the
she
locality.
wouldn't dare recognize that today
Okay.
because it hurts her political constituents
Right.
to recognize that fact. You know, she said, well, we could maybe work something out if you recognize that the state and the local level pays more if they get illegal immigrants. And it's not
Okay,
fair
hold
for the
on, hold
federal
on.
government.
So any other questions?
I think students have to leave for other classes. I will let you guys go. And thanks a lot for coming. And
Thank you. Okay.
all